Hello, and welcome to another chapter in the eBike series. Uh, Unfortunately, this one is going to be all talking and no doing, but I think it is appropriate for me to talk about battery and cell safety, especially because I'm building my own e-bike battery. It stands to reason that I should probably be putting some safety features in place because we all know an 18 a lithium ion battery is a little tiny firecracker, right, that can really hurt people if it goes off. And I'm using 128 of those to build my e-bike battery. Yeah, having 128 little firecrackers under my bike could potentially be a safety issue. So I've put a few layers of safety in place, and I want to talk about those just in case someone who's not familiar with all this stuff quite yet happens on these videos and says, "Gee, that'd be fun to build a battery out of old laptop cells." Well, yeah, it is. It is a lot of fun, but there are some things you got to keep in mind, and I will. Some of these I'll just run right through briefly, and some will require a little bit more explanation. So let's jump into it. I came up with 10 layers of safety to keep the battery safe on my e-bike. When you design your battery for your particular project or needs, it'll be completely up to you which of these safety features you will add to your battery and which you won't, and maybe you'll come up with a different, some other layer of safety that isn't listed here. But these are 10 things that I did to make sure that my e-bike battery is going to be safe. And some of these are tailored specifically to the e-bike. Yeah, ignore the cat. He's fine. He's just kind of a drama king. Anyway, let's get into it here. Let's see if I can make this bigger, actually. Yeah. Hey, look at that. Okay. So, number one is cell testing. And, this may go without saying, but let's say it anyway. Test all your cells. You test your old used cells, test your questionable cells, test your brand new cells. It doesn't matter. You should test all of your cells. At least that's my recommendation to you. You can take it or leave it, agree with it, disagree with it. But it seems obvious why you should test used cells, right? Because you don't know if they're any good or not, so testing will tell you if they're any good or not. Why would you test new cells? Well, there are a couple types of, there are a couple things out there that will get you. One is counterfeit cells, and the other is pretty much fake cells. And even if you're buying from what you think is a reputable source, your reputable source could inadvertently get a shipment of counterfeit or fake cells inadvertently. So what do I mean by fake and counterfeit? Okay, so a fake cell is a cell that is in fact, 3.7 volts nominal. However, if you were to open up that cell, instead of finding your typical cell, your typical wrapping, roll of lithium ion stuff, instead you'd find a little tiny pouch cell, a little tiny lithium ion pouch cell with the positive end soldered to the positive side and the negative end on the jacket, and then basically you have an empty jacket with a little tiny pouch cell inside, or a little or a jacket with a little tiny pouch cell with sand filled with sand or whatever to make it heavier, like a regular 18650. Counterfeit cell is a cell that is made by a non-reputable company, or it's a refurbished cell. It's a cell that's been harvested from an old battery, and all they've done is replace the jacket with one that looks like a reputable company's cell. So it looks like it's a it's been re-shrink wrapped to look like a Panasonic or a Sanyo or a Samsung or an LG or whatever, and it's actually not. And it's packaged and it's sold as a new cell, but it's in fact a used cell. That's what I mean by counterfeit. And somewhere in between is cells like these ultra fire cells. Any cell with fire in the name, just don't buy those. And also cells that advertise their capacity anywhere above 4,000 milliamp hours. It's chemically not possible, chemically and physically not possible to get more than about 3,600 or so milliamp hours into a single 18650. The technology just doesn't exist, at least right now. And so, if you're buying if you're seeing cells that are advertised as 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 milliamp hours of capacity, they are lying to you. And so you got to ask yourself, do I really want to buy cells from a company that lies? If they're lying to you about that, what else are they lying about? Running these brand new cells, any of these brand new cells, through the basic cell testing is going to show you which ones are good and which ones are bad. So the cell testing itself, the first thing to do is check on the physical condition. If it's punctured or damaged in any way, good idea not to use it. The second test is test its ability to charge. Now, if you're using a smart tester or a smart charger like an Opus or an IMAX, if you have a cell that's under voltage, your tester will probably tell you that it's no good. I would recommend putting it on a TP4056 charger board or a TP5100 charge controller board, because they are not smart chargers, they're just charge controllers, and they actually have the ability to recharge a cell even if it's under voltage. What I mean by under voltage is like if it's much below 3 volts, like if it's below 2.5 volts or below 2 volts, the charger may simply refuse to charge it because it either thinks it's the wrong kind of battery or it thinks it's bad. And some folks, if the cell is under voltage, they just won't test it. They'll just throw it away. I would recommend throwing it on a TP4056 board or similar, like I said, because they will try to charge the cell no matter what. If you put a cell on there, it'll try to charge it. And in fact, it has a little pre-charge function where if it's below 3 volts, it'll give it a tenth of the full current until it reaches 3 volts. Then it'll give it the maximum current until it reaches 4.2 volts and does its constant voltage thing. But anyway, that's that would be my recommendation. Again, follow it, don't follow it, it's up to you. But anyway, that'll tell you whether it has the ability to charge. If you can get a current to go through it, if you can get the voltage to go up, if it starts charging normally, that's a good indication that it can charge. Which brings us to the third test, which is to see whether it's a heater or not. Sometimes when a cell approaches full charge, it will start to get hot. Healthy lithium-ion cells do not get hot. So if you have a lithium-ion cell that's charging and it's getting hot, you have yourself a heater. There's not much you can do if you have a heater. you can attempt to repair it by pulling it off the charger and putting it on a discharger and discharging it all the way down to, whatever, like in the case of the Opus, 2.8 volts, and then put it back on, say, the TP4056 and let it charge again. If it still gets hot, then yeah, it's a heater. Yeah, so if you have yourself a heater, it's a really bad idea to use that cell. Best thing you can do with that cell is recycle it. Let's say your cell was hot, you discharged it, you recharged it, and now it charges all the way up again. Well, now it's up to your discretion whether you still use it or whether you go ahead and recycle it anyway. I like to run mine through the rest of the tests just to see, because I like to test everything. But so say you have a cell that either was a heater and isn't now, or never was a heater. Okay, fully charged on the TP4056 board or whatever charger you're using. Okay, so then the next test is capacity. You want to find out how many milliamp hours your cell actually has. A laptop cell, an old laptop cell, will have somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 milliamp hours, sometimes less, sometimes more. It depends on the health of the cell and the make and model of it. But I'll get into that in a minute. But yeah, so you put your cell on a discharger like the Opus. The Opus is by far the most popular discharge tester, but there are other ones. There's one that starts with an L, I think. Anyway, there are lots of different ones. The Opus, I believe, is the cheapest, and it does a decent job. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's okay. It does well enough that it is the most popular. Anyway, you put it on your capacity discharger tester thing, like the Opus, and you pick your discharge current. Most people pick 1 amp. A few people, like me, I pick 500 milliamps or half an amp. But the key to picking your discharge current is either knowing the recommended discharge current of the cell that you're testing, or another way you could do it is, what discharge current are you planning on having that battery or that cell do in its future use, assuming that it passes all your tests and stuff. So for example, if you plan on using your cell at 1 amp discharge, then you should probably test it at 1 amp discharge. If you're like me and I try to keep all my cells at 500 milliamp hours or less when I'm using them, then testing them at 500 milliamp hour or 500 milliamps is just fine. Once the battery gets down to 2.8 or so volts, the bottom voltage, then your capacity tester will tell you what the capacity is, and you may see that your cells actually recover voltage a little bit. So in the case of the Opus, it'll discharge it down to 2.8 volts. Once the load is removed from the cell, you'll actually see the voltage rise up to maybe 3.1, 3.5 volts. Now that doesn't mean that the charger didn't discharge the cell properly. It means that when you take your load off of your cell, you're going to recover some voltage. But if you put that load back on, it'll fall right back down to the discharge voltage. And that's another point is when you read a spec sheet and it says your discharge voltage is 2.8 volts, that means 2.8 volts under load. That's the key. That's a key thing to understand, is that your discharge voltage is under load, and the higher the load, the faster you're going to reach your maximum discharge voltage. Yeah. So again, that's another reason to test your cell at whatever voltage or whatever current you plan to use it at, because that's going to tell you, I mean, if you discharge a cell at half an amp, you're going to get a larger capacity reading than if you discharge your cell at, say, 2 amps. That's just kind of the nature of these cells. So I think I've gone on enough about that. Oh, once you know your capacity, by the way, once you know your capacity, once again, it's up to your discretion to decide whether that capacity is good or not. Some people throw their cells out if they're anything less than 2,000 milliamp hours. Personally, I keep all my cells that are 1,000 milliamp hours or greater. Other people draw the line at 1,500. It kind of depends on why you're collecting these cells, what you're planning on using them for. Is it for a single project, like a house battery? You know, you're going to make a DIY power wall, or are you going to use it for a number of different projects? See, that's what I do. Is I save my cells and then I categorize them by capacity, and then use the higher capacity cells for certain projects and use the lower capacity cells for certain other projects. But anyway, so the capacity, whether the capacity is good or not, that is your discretion. You can compare it to the cell specs for that particular make and model, but ultimately the capacity just depends on what you are looking for. Okay, now the last one is, does the cell have the ability to retain charge when you're not using it? See, a normal healthy lithium-ion cell can maintain a charge for at least a couple years if you set it on a shelf. You know, there will always be some self-discharge, but lithium-ion cells are really good at retaining their charge over time. And so what I do is I set my cells on a shelf. I storage charge them. So I charge them up to 3.8 volts and then set them on a shelf. The reason why I do that, I mean, a lot of people, probably most people, when they do a self-discharge test, they will charge it all the way up to 4.2 volts, then set it on a shelf for a week or two or maybe a month, and then see how much it's lost. I prefer to do the storage charge, 3.8 volts. It's higher than the nominal voltage, but it's not all the way full. And that's actually, when you're storing a lithium-ion cell, it's actually better for the cell if you store it at not quite full voltage. If your cell is able to maintain its voltage over the course of a week or two or a month or however long you have patience to do this test, then it's fine. If it self-discharges, well, think about whether you want a self-discharging cell in a larger battery. You know, keep in mind that as your cell discharges, the cells around it in parallel with it are going to discharge into that cell, because cells in parallel are self-balancing, right? And so this one self-discharging cell can bring down your entire series, all the cells in parallel with it. And that's not necessarily a good thing. So again, it's kind of up to you how much self-discharge is too much self-discharge. But yeah, you'll have to use your own discretion on that, but at least you'll know, and then you can make an educated decision on whether to keep each individual cell that you test or whether to recycle it. So that's the first and hopefully most long-winded layer of safety, is test your cells. So the second layer of safety here is individual cell fusing. So put a fuse on each individual cell when you put it connected up into a battery. This protects the cells in your battery from internal problems, For example, if you have 16 cells in parallel and one of them suddenly has some kind of a catastrophic failure and it starts self-discharging. If all of your cells are individually fused, then what will happen is as your healthy cells are discharging into that one bad cell, you've got 15 cells all dumping their power into a bad cell. That bad cell is going to experience quite a bit of current, right? Well, if you have a fuse on that cell and it blows, suddenly your bad cell is now electrically isolated from the rest of the battery, and so no more current can go in or out of that cell. It does its own thing. It catastrophically fails. Hopefully, it doesn't explode or catch fire or anything, but but at least it has a chance now that it's now that the fuse has been blown. So that's one example of why it's a good idea to put a fuse on each of your cells. The type of fuse, some people use fuse wire, other people use axial glass fuses. I prefer the axial glass fuses, but that's personal preference. And also, what current should your fuse blow at? Well, that depends on the cells you're using and the current you intend to run through each cell. I would say get a fuse that will blow at roughly twice the current that your cells are going to be asked to give. So for example, my e-bike battery, I'm going to be asking a maximum of about 3 amps from each cell, hopefully less, but I'm going to be asking about 3 amps from each of those cells. So what I've done is I've bought a bunch of axial glass fuses. I bought them all rated at 3 amps. Now that may seem contradictory to what I just said. However, keep in mind that these axial glass fuses actually blow at about twice their rating. So when you buy a 3 amp axial glass fuse, they don't blow at 3 amps. You can use them at 3 amps. They blow at about 6 amps. And they're slow blow fuses too. I don't know if they're supposed to be slow blow versus fast blow, but I've definitely noticed that you can actually get them to function as little light bulbs for a little while, if you're real careful with how much current you put through them. But again, if you go to secondlifestorage.com, there's a fellow named Average Joe and I think a couple other folks who've done extensive testing on these little axial glass fuses, and they pretty much, it's very consistent that they all blow at about twice their rating. So just keep that in mind if you go to buy axial glass fuses. But I like them because they have nice thick leads. Like if you're using a fuse wire, the entire wire is the fuse, right? And that means that teeny tiny wire has resistance to it because a lot of resistance to it because it's so thin. With the axial glass fuses, the actual fuse wire is really, really short. And so you only have this one little bottleneck of fuse wire that you have to, push your current through, as opposed to an entire length of wire. And also, I like the fact that when they blow, it's all contained inside the glass capsule, and so you don't have any sparks going on outside the fuse, if that makes sense. So anyway, I like the little glass axial fuses, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with using fuse wire if you want. Totally up to you. All this stuff's totally up to you. Anyway, step 3 or safety 3 is know what your battery is supposed to be able to do, and don't ask more of it than it is intended. For example, like I just said, I plan to draw 3 amps from each of the cells in my battery, but most laptop battery cells have a maximum discharge rate of around 500 milliamps. I've seen them anywhere from 300 milliamps all the way up to 4 point something amps. And so how do you know how much current can safely be put through your cell? Well, you got to find out the cell specification. Let me see if I can get, oh, there we go. Okay, so let's go to the data sheet. This is a data sheet that can be found on the cell database at secondlifestorage.com. And in my case, I have 128 of the same cell. They're Samsung ICR 1865022Fs. And there happens to be a data sheet available for these guys, which is why I bought them. And if we look on the specifications list here, we see that their nominal capacity is 2200 milliamp hours. Nominal voltage is listed at 3.6 volts. Charging method, constant current, constant voltage. Charging current, 1.1 amp or 2.2 amps to rapid charge. Charging time, 2.5 to 3 hours. We've got maximum charge current. Here we go. Okay, here we go. Maximum discharge current, 4.4 amps, 4,400 milliamps. So each of these cells can safely provide 4.4 amps continuously. Does that mean you should? Yeah, probably not. But you can. Like anything, using something at its maximum ability for a long period of time will use it up faster, So, but the nice thing is, the good news is, knowing that these cells can provide 4.4 amps continuously, my requirement of around 3 amps is reasonable. That's something that these cells should certainly be able to do. Now, if I looked it up and it said the maximum discharge current was 500 milliamps, I would have to conclude that these are the wrong cells for my battery, or I need a much bigger battery to handle the current. But anyway, so knowing how much current you can safely draw from these batteries, these cells, your particular cell is an important thing, because if you draw too much, you'll overheat the cell, and of course we all know lithium ion cells plus heat equals bad. So one definite safety feature is knowing the limits of the cells that you're using. And then, of course, the operating temperature. General rule of thumb is if you're comfortable, the cell is comfortable. If you're uncomfortably cold or uncomfortably hot, then so is the cell. If you know these things, you'll be able to treat your cell well. And if you treat your cell well, your cell will treat you well and not explode. So number 4 is a battery fuse. Now, that's different than the cell fuse. What I mean by cell fuse is a fuse on each individual cell in your battery. By battery fuse, I mean an actual large fuse for the battery as a whole. Now, the cell fuse protects your cells from internal battery issues. The battery fuse is going to protect your whole battery from external issues, like I don't know, like you accidentally short the positive and negative, and with a fuse, you have to buy a new battery fuse. Without a fuse, you have to buy 128 cell fuses. and then you have to desolder all the old ones and resolder all the new ones. Yeah. So battery fuse for $5 or $10, totally worth it. Like in my case, I have a 60 amp fuse, which I believe will blow before the individual cell fuses. So yeah, a whole battery fuse. Number 5 is battery management. Now, battery management is usually done with a BMS board, a BMS circuit board, battery management system board. And that is, in fact, what I'm using. Now, different BMSs have different capabilities. Some only protect against overvoltage and undervoltage. Others will protect against the voltages and also overcurrent. And the better ones will provide all that protection, plus they will keep your series in balance. So in my case, I have 8 series, and this the BMS board I bought is constantly monitoring the voltage and trying to bring all the series into balance and have them stay at the same voltage, whether I'm charging, discharging, or whether it's just sitting on a shelf or whatever. That BMS is always sitting there working. A fuse does not protect against voltage. Not everybody realizes that. It may seem obvious to some people, but for other people, fuses only protect against current. You can put twice as much voltage into some electronic thing and blow it up, having never blown the fuse, because if you didn't put too much current in, just too much voltage, then the voltage blew up your electronic thing. The BMS will protect your battery from getting too much voltage in, but it also protects against undervoltage, which is more important to me because that will cut the battery off before I drain it so far that I start damaging the cells, or just start really damaging the cells. I believe it has a 2.5 volt cutoff, and these cells aren't supposed to go below 2.75 volts, but at least 2.5 volt is better than 2 volt or 1.5 volt or whatever. Okay, so the next one is an isolation switch. Basically, it's an on-off switch, but it's like a manual cutoff. And actually, let me go to my little diagram here up here. Ooh, maybe I can make that. Ooh, I can make that big too. So here is where my isolation switch is, and this is basically a great big on-off switch. On-off switch, basically. What I bought is a car battery isolation switch, I think. Anyway, it's rated to something like, well, it's rated above 60 amps. And so when it's on, you can put more than 60 amps through it, and it's fine. So it's a big, I just got it in the mail today. It's a big, beefy switch. But it's as chunky as it is, it's still relatively compact, so I like it. But what that's going to do is that's going to completely isolate the battery from all of this positive stuff. I want to be able to turn the battery completely off from all this other stuff, but I still want to be able to use the battery monitor. And of course I want to charge the battery. But I'd like to charge the battery with everything, all this other stuff off. So that's what I mean by isolation switch. Now, I also am going to put in a dead man switch. And that's a switch that always has, it's a momentary on switch. It always has to be pressed if I want power to my motor. And again, let's back up to this diagram. So my dead man switch is right here. It's a little switch that runs 12 volts over to a relay, and then when the switch is depressed and therefore on, we have 12 volts going into the relay, into the low voltage side of the relay, which causes the high voltage side of the relay to close, and thus power from the battery can go through the relay and into the PWM controller. If I take my thumb off that switch, off that little dead man switch for any reason, a pedestrian gets in my way, I have to scratch my nose, I get hit by a comet, a traffic light turns red or something, whatever. Any reason my thumb comes off that switch, power is instantly lost to the motor. Now I have this relay after this other stuff because I want the fans to keep going, I want the meters to keep running, but I want the motor to instantly shut off, right? So I can control the motor speed with the little potentiometer, but I can instantly have it shut off by taking my finger off the dead man switch. And incidentally, I would also want to turn the motor off when I'm going downhill or pedaling along a flat piece of ground. I only need the motor to help me get up hills. So that's both convenience. That's both for convenience and for safety. Say, for example, I fall off the bike. My thumb will obviously come off of the dead man switch, and so my bike will not continue to try to turn the back wheel while I'm sitting on the ground trying to figure out what happened. Anyway, so that's the dead man switch. Okay, so the eighth thing I can think of is direct monitoring of the battery. And that's kind of the same thing that the BMS does, except with the BMS, it's just a passive circuit board. I guess passive is the right word. It's a circuit board. It sits there, and it looks exactly the same whether it's doing anything or not doing anything. So how do you tell if it's doing anything? Well, you have your own direct way of monitoring. So I plan to add an ammeter. That's an ammeter to find out how much current is going into the motor itself. So I'm monitoring how much current is being drawn by the motor. So if I'm getting past 50, I need to start thinking about how I can use less power. The other monitor is a temperature monitor, a thermometer. So I found a really neat deal on AliExpress for like $5. There's this little dual dual display temperature gauge, and I mean it's digital, but it gives you two temperatures, and coming out the back of the gauge are two temperature probes, thermistors. But yeah, so it's like, well, that's cool. That means I could put one probe in the motor and monitor the motor's temperature, and I still have a second probe. I can stick that in the battery box and monitor the temperature of the battery box. I can't monitor the temperature of every single cell, but if the box starts getting significantly warmer than the ambient air temperature, that gives me an idea that maybe I should see if there's something wrong with the battery. And then the last direct monitor that I have, I actually just have it written here as a battery monitor. I actually showed it in another video. It's a little battery checker, but it's a little bit fancier than the regular ones. What it does is it gives you the overall voltage of the battery, and at the same time, simultaneously, it gives you the voltage of each individual series in your battery up to 8S, which I just happen to have an 8S battery. So that works out perfect. I can hit a button on that battery monitor, and instantly find out the voltage of the battery, and if I have any issues with any of the series dropping too fast or something. I can check and make sure that those are nice and balanced, and and I can get real-time information from that. I don't have to wait till I get home and plug a multimeter into it or something. I can just instantly see it right there. And then number 9 is physical encasement of the battery. And if you were to buy a store-bought e-bike battery, it would already come in a nice, robust plastic or metal box, right? And then you just mount it to your bike. Well, in my case, I'm using a whole bunch of individual cells that I soldered together, and they're going to need protection from environmental hazards like, I don't know, splashing through a puddle or accidentally getting kicked, or maybe a dog chewing on it or something. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, physical protection from the environment. And my last bit of e-bike safety is proper charging. Charging the battery properly goes a long way towards keeping it safe. For example, you don't want to put too much voltage into it. You don't want to put too much current into it, and you want to make sure your series stay balanced. So what I'm building is I'm building a charger that will actually charge each individual series independently, as if it's its own battery. But there are different ways to charge. But yeah, again, you want to know your maximum charge specification, which in this case is 2.2 amps. But their standard charge is 1.1. So I mean, kind of like, they recommend 1.1 amps, but these cells could tolerate up to 2.2 amps. So there you have it. There are 10, I guess, layers of safety here that I'm employing for my e-bike battery to keep it safe from various things. There is no way to keep your battery safe from all possibilities, but there are things that you can do to mitigate the risks. Well, this at least lets you know the safety features that I'm employing on my e-bike battery. It'll give you an idea of what you might want to do on your project battery, whether it's an e-bike battery or whatever battery. I hope you found this video at least tolerable. Hopefully it gave you some ideas and some things to think about. And as always, thank you for watching.